I thought I'd start with what is stupid accountability. If we're talking about intelligent accountability. I was there when David Miliband first used the phrase, I think, in it seems like 15 years ago in Belfast. And stupid accountability, just to be obvious, is if it's based on fear, if it's based on low trust, if it eats up a lot of time at the expense of learning, and you could add 2 or 3 to that list. But if you move to intelligent accountability, and Judy Halbert in the last session gave a very good definition, so I want to give my rendition very similar to that, because it does have to end up being accountable. It can't be just that the other thing is bad. So the accountable intelligence, I put 6 things down here. One is high expectations. We can define that in a lot of different ways, but definitely high expectations for all students. So that's one. Good data that are used primarily for improvement. It's a second ingredient. These are common, coming up all the time now, but it's important to have that checklist and put them into practice. Transparency, that everybody knows what you're doing, whether you're failing or succeeding, so that even mere transparency has its virtues if it's embedded in the other 5 things I'm talking about. Use the group to change the group, one of our key themes in professional capital. And when you use the group to change the group, there's certainly help and development and support, but there's also reciprocal accountability that's built into the daily culture, and that's why it's more effective as accountable. Trust with verification. So you trust, unlike the low trust example, trust through verification means that there is generally a trust that this will work, and because the other ingredients are actually interact to make most of it work, you still want to say that intervention is verification. Intervention is going to be necessary along the way. It's not your main point, but is part and parcel of making sure that accountability happens. And then the last one is that the whole thing needs to be linked to some some instance of proof that it's working, that it's going in the right direction. There's evidence to doing that. And I would say if you have all of those 6 things, you have intelligent accountability. And then one last thing, overall theme that I think for me, for this work we're doing with trying to get whole systems to change, is that you are stuck with the policies of the center, but you're not stuck with their mindsets. You have lots of choices at the mindset side, as evident in all of the pockets of things. So the next phase is to have those pockets get connected, connect the dots, get leverage, get the vast majority of schools and networks like this, and intelligent accountability will be embedded. Thank you very much.
It is so important that schools engage with all the stakeholders and agree the parameters in which they're going to operate, and that there's openness and transparency. And if Christine Gilbert had been here, she would have talked today about the importance of you telling your story. How do you want to be judged? You've discussed with your stakeholders the views, you've got your principles. It's the same as Tim was talking about with the curriculum. You have your school curriculum, you've got your reasons why you're doing it in this way. Yes, there's going to be results, but equally, when somebody comes in, you're able to tell your story. And again, Christine says this time and time again, get your story right, constantly review what you're doing. Admit when when things haven't gone right, a transparency and an openness. And again, okay, perhaps start with your own school or your federation of schools, but the power of networks, the thing that always impresses me is the work that Judy and Linda have done. They've brought a whole network together to improve, as Michael often says, single-handed results in British Columbia. We're a network. We can work together. We can do this.
Intelligent accountability is not just the data, and I think people often think that it is. It is a complex framework, and we've got to see it as a framework, and intelligent accountability exists in coherence across the relationships within the accountability framework, inspection, data, and so on. But it includes the interpretation and the action which is taken on the part of the information coming from an inspection, data collection, and so on. One of the key things I think about this conference is the word principle, because so frequently we hear, well, I do this because of accountability, but I think it's wrong. Well, that's wrong in a system. And what we've got to do is make very clear what our principles are. Because if accountability is forcing us to do things which are against a very well-grounded set of principles derived from research, evaluation, experience, then that accountability framework is wrong. And so I think that's really fundamental. A couple of final points on this. There's no point in just the different bits of the framework trying to do the same thing. We were going to a position where the inspectorate was overdriven by data. Well, then why have inspection? They're essentially doing the same thing. Because inspection can do things that the collection and aggregation of data can't. So be very clear about what the different bits of your accountability framework are actually doing. The final point, I think, though, is fundamental and has to go along with a clarity in terms of principles. And that is, the accountability framework often implies forms of improvement that aren't real or even possible. You have to understand what improvement is possible in an education system over what period of time. And if we chase what's really possible, what can constitute real improvement, and make the accountability framework sensitive to the types of improvement that we really want to see, then we'll have intelligent accountability. Rob Coe's work at Durham is really, really bang on the button. It's quite clear we've got grade inflation in our qualification system. The argument is not whether we've got it or whether we haven't, it's how much of it is inflation and how much of it is real improvement. And if our accountability system can't disentangle those two things, then we haven't got intelligent accountability.
I quite like Ofsted and the framework, and I'll tell you why I like it. Because when I go into some very damaged schools, had they just followed the framework, they would have understood what needed to have happened in order to improve the life chances of those children. They got distracted. They do things that seem right, latest fad, lots of prizes and points for praise, but didn't tackle underlying issues of poor behaviour or an atmosphere conducive for learning in the classroom. So the accountability framework through Ofsted, you just read it, you follow it, you do it, and it gets more schools moving. But that's not what it's about. After that, it's about really developing the pedagogy in a school and then getting professional buy-in from staff who may well have been under the impression that it was okay to do something not quite as focused on outcomes for children. Because you can't run schools without thinking about outcomes for all children. And it's something that people miss, and I'm staggered when we go into schools. They don't go in special measures just for performance. You find that there's poor attendance. One school we went into, every single member of staff had hit the attendance trigger. It was my turn to have a day off. They'd forgotten why they were there. So when you go to the framework, you've got a clear framework, you can share it with people and say, we need to do this. And then something really interesting happens. That's why I like accountability frameworks. Then you get buy-in. Because if you go with a negative view of accountability, the staff will have that negative view. If you say, we owe it to our children to do this, and actually the Ofsted framework is a useful template to base our work on, then you get a different feeling from staff. If you talk Ofsted up, they talk Ofsted up. That's what we do. We say we like Ofsted. We like the fact that when we go into schools, they know exactly where they stand and we know where they stand. That's one thing. The second thing is, when you get into schools, I'm lucky because we can meet all our principals and directors. We have directors of maths, science, English who are supernumerary. We find that conversations start between professionals, and then this really interesting thing happens. They buy in, they have a shared vision, and then they get this freedom to lead. That's in the classroom and in the leadership team. And it's amazing what you can do. But it starts at the framework. So I'm all for it. And one last thing, if I may. I like the new accountability measure. I was worried that it was just only going to attainment. But actually, when you get progress 8, that's good. Because schools in difficult circumstances, you should be teaching your children. They might not get the 5HC, but they can certainly make progress. So I like progress 8. I like attainment 8. English and maths, obviously, they need to be there. They're for what we do in the future. EBAC, it's there. And the 5th one, yet to be defined, about destinations. I'll watch that with interest. So actually, I think I'm looking forward to it. And the final thing I'd say on that, throughout my educational career, The worst thing you can do is push up against something and say, it's not for me. The best thing you can do is get in early, grab it, shape it, and make it work for you. So I'm quite comfortable with the notion of accountability frameworks.
I've really enjoyed the debates and the discussions, and I think it's important for us as a profession to take control of what we feel accountability should be about. Tim Oates, I've heard him speak twice now, and I've been impressed with the challenge for the profession. We have to understand more about the why. And I think sometimes in education we understand the what, that's come from government and so forth, but not really understand why. So I think that this is a really move forward in terms of educators taking control of our profession. So thank you very much, SSAT, and thank you very much, speakers, for your wonderful contributions.
If you embrace the Ofsted accountability framework as a school, rather than focusing primarily on pupils and pupil outcomes, because I don't think they're always entirely the same thing, don't you risk embracing that same deficit model, and which can lead to a real decline in morale amongst staff?
The bottom line is we are there for the children, and the confident school will explain what they're doing and why they're doing it, and they are getting the results. In the many years ago when I was Ofsteded, the one thing was, it's right, you have to get the staff behind you to understand. Ofsted is not going to disappear. When we did the symposium redesigning schooling, when we did Christine's session, we just said from the beginning, we're not going to discuss about whether we should have Ofsted or not. It's not going to disappear in my lifetime. So that's a pointless argument. So therefore, I support Michael's view very much that you've got to be proactive about it.
Thank you. Tim?
Yeah, I mean, obviously today I've talked a lot about at the level of principle. In essence, that's what the conference is about. And we've heard some very pragmatic and practical inputs, both from the stage and from the workshops. And I think that's right, that balance of what's a principle, what do you do? And I just want to encapsulate it in one particular thing that I saw in a school around intelligent accountability. Good school, but again the school was saying, it was a primary school, oh dear, we've got 4 kids below the threshold that could just get over it, and so we'll put on a load of special provision for them to get them over the threshold. And of course, that's exactly contrary to the kind of the principles which are being avowed by this conference. What that school should have done is said, what is it about our maths provision has meant that these 4 kids are where they are? And what is it about our provision that is not actually ensuring equity and getting everybody over the threshold? And for as long as schools actually think about how can we just tweak this bit to meet this threshold, we're actually living in the past rather than really capitalising on everything that we've heard here today to move forward in terms of equitable outcomes, high achievement and high enjoyment.
Thanks, Tim. Michael?
Just the Ofsted question. Remember I said they come and they go, and I treat it just like that. They come and they go, but the main job is teaching young people. So I've got Ofsted in perspective in my mind. But what I talked about today was about 2 types. I'm talking about when you start to lift schools off the floor. That's a completely different approach and story when you start to really develop schools, which is all the things that we would recognise in schools. But my talk, unfortunately, only talked about getting them off the floor.